This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss.
Oof, like wind in your hair carefree.
Oh, like using Clorox Disinfecting All-Purpose Cleaner in the home carefree.
Yes!
Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox Carefree?
He's on a roll now.
Spit toothpaste on the faucet?
You got it. You got it.
Peanut butter on the light switch.
Oh, spritz, spritz.
Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good.
Okay, we're back.
Use as directed.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
Welcome back to Mama Mystery. I am your host, Kelly, and today we are talking about a Harvard-educated biologist, devoted mom of four, and respected professor climbing the academic ladder. But beneath her impressive resume was a history of buried secrets, unchecked rage, and disturbing red flags that no one seemed willing to acknowledge, until one cold afternoon in February of 2010, when Amy walked into a faculty meeting armed with a loaded gun, ruining lives and revealing a past that would make everyone wonder, was this shocking violence really so unexpected after all? This is the story of Amy Bishop. Amy Bishop grew up in the suburban town of Braintree, Massachusetts, just south of Boston. She was born in 1965 to Judy and Sam Bishop, and she had one younger brother, Seth, who was born in 1968. The Bishop family was by all accounts stable and loving. Mom Judy was an outgoing woman from an old New England family active in the local scene, and Amy's father, Sam, was a reserved art professor of Greek descent who taught at Northeastern University. Amy and Seth were raised in a comfortable middle-class home. Neighbors recalled Judy as the friendly town spokesperson type who just knew everyone, and the family was well regarded in their community. From a young age, Amy stood out as bright and high-achieving. She was an accomplished violinist in her youth, and she really excelled in school. Both she and her little brother were interested in music and science, often playing instruments and tinkering with ideas together. Amy's childhood friends remember her as an intelligent, if intense, little girl. She did have to cope with severe allergies and asthma attacks. Her childhood was punctuated by trips to the emergency room, which could have contributed to an early fascination with biology and medicine. So by the time she was a teenager, Amy's academic talents were evident. She attended Braintree High School and then stayed local for college, enrolling at Northeastern University in Boston, where her father taught to study biology. Amy's family life seemed ordinary and happy from the outside, but as she grew into early adulthood, an unexpected tragedy would strike the Bishop's idyllic household, one that would profoundly affect Amy. On the afternoon of December 6, 1986, 21-year-old Amy Bishop shot and killed her 18-year-old brother Seth in the kitchen of their family home in Braintree. The circumstances of this shooting were mysterious and would remain controversial for years. That morning, Judy Bishop had left the house early to attend to her horse in a nearby town and returned home around midday. According to Judy's account, she and Seth were in the kitchen when Amy came downstairs holding her father's 12-gauge shotgun, which had been kept in the parents' bedroom closet for home defense after a burglary a year earlier. Amy told them she didn't know how to unload the weapon and asked Seth for help. So as Amy shifted the shotgun in her hands to show it to her brother, it suddenly went off, firing a round directly into 18-year-old Seth's chest. Seth collapsed to the floor, mortally wounded. Judy later recalled her son's last words, saying, "Oh no, Mom," before he fell. And I cannot even imagine the horrific scene on that kitchen floor, witnessing your daughter shoot your son, accidentally or not. I just cannot imagine how traumatic that would be. But in a panic after the gun discharged, Amy fled the house with the shotgun still in her hands. And what happened next was equally bizarre. Amy ran to a local auto dealership, Dinger Ford, just down the street, and demanded a car at gunpoint from the frightened employees. You have to remember, she's 21 years old. She's not just a kid. One mechanic, Tom Pettigrew, later testified that Amy had pointed the shotgun and shouted, "Put your hands up," as if attempting to hijack a vehicle. Police soon arrived and found a distraught Amy outside the dealership. At first, she refused to drop the weapon, only relenting when an officer managed to sneak up behind her and disarm her. She was taken into custody within minutes of the shooting. So then down at the Braintree police station, Amy told officers a story that she would stick to for decades. She said that she had been alone in the house that morning and, feeling nervous about a prior home invasion, decided to retrieve her father's shotgun for protection. Amy claimed she loaded the gun using shells as her brother had once shown her, and then tried to unload it, during which process the firearm accidentally went off in her upstairs bedroom, blasting a hole in the wall or mirror. Startled and unable to remove the remaining shells, she headed downstairs to ask Seth for help, and that's when the shotgun accidentally fired a second time, hitting her brother. She said it was an accident. She insisted to the police that she had not meant to shoot her brother Seth, but I have to wonder, what were Seth and Judy doing in the kitchen when they heard this gun go off? Or like how much time had passed between the shots? Like, I just can't imagine staying where you're at despite hearing a shotgun go off upstairs. But tragically, Seth Bishop was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after from the chest wound. And then in an astonishing decision, after a few hours of questioning, police released Amy Bishop into her parents' custody that same evening. The incident was investigated by local and state authorities, but within 11 days, the file was closed. The death of Seth Bishop was officially ruled an accidental shooting, a terrible mishap with no criminal intent, so no charges were filed against Amy, and then District Attorney Bill Delahunt, who later became a U.S. congressman, accepted the Braintree's police assessment of the case as an accident. At the time, the Bishop family and local officials treated Seth's death as a horrific accident and nothing more. Judy and Sam Bishop publicly stated years later in 2010 that there was no evidence that Seth's death was not an accident. However, even in 1986, there were some unusual aspects. For instance, officers on the scene found that 2 shots had been fired, one upstairs through Amy's bedroom wall or mirror. I think the mirror was against the wall, so it hit both, but one was also in the kitchen into Seth. And Amy's bizarre attempt to hijack a car from a dealership at gunpoint while fleeing the house also raised some eyebrows. Braintree police initially logged possible charges of assault and even murder on the arrest sheet, according to one lieutenant at least, but those charges were never formally filed since Amy was released on orders from the police chief before there was any arraignment. Later speculation would suggest that Judy Bishop, desperate not to lose her only remaining child after Seth's death, intervened with authorities. Officers recalled Judy arriving at the station and asking to speak with the police chief at the time, John Polio, even calling him by his first name, which was like an unusual level of familiarity. One officer remembered Judy pleading, "I've lost my son today. I don't want to lose my daughter," before Amy was let go. So whether due to the bishop's local influence or simply a rush to compassion, Amy walked free that night. The shotgun was returned to the family after ballistics tests and eventually went missing from evidence, and life in Braintree seemingly just moved on. For Amy, the trauma of that day was profound, and yet she never received counseling or therapy after killing her brother. The family continued living in the same house on Hollis Avenue for years, preserving Seth's bedroom just as it was, with his name still on the door. Amy had to literally pass the sight of her brother's death every day, which could only have compounded her guilt and grief. Friends observed that Amy coped by pouring herself into her studies. She returned to classes at Northeastern University soon after and excelled academically, earning top grades despite, or perhaps because of, the personal tragedy. By unspoken agreement, people in Amy's life rarely mentioned Seth again, and one college classmate later said, quote, "You just knew, don't bring it up." And Amy herself never spoke about her brother from that point on. In the years after Seth's death, Amy Bishop focused fiercely on building a quote-unquote normal life. She graduated from Northeastern University and in 1988 began a PhD program in genetics at Harvard University. So this was a prestigious and challenging path, and Amy admittedly struggled at times in Harvard's competitive environment. One insider later described her as a weak doctoral candidate, saying that she never should have gotten a degree, suggesting that she was not a star student by Harvard standards, but nevertheless, Amy persevered and she revised her dissertation and successfully earned her PhD in 1993. Amid her graduate studies, Amy found personal happiness as well. She had met James, or Jim Anderson, at Northeastern in a campus Dungeons and Dragons club, of all places, and the two hit it off. Now, to give you an idea of what this couple looks like, I'm going to put pictures on the cover art for this episode, but also on our Instagram and social media so you can see. But this is like quite the unassuming couple. So Amy actually reminds me of Edna Goad, I think is her name, off of The Incredibles. And she's got that like super short bob with the like harsh bangs, and her bob is kind of curled under, if you can imagine, and it's like right above her chin. So it's just a very unflattering haircut. And I know right now because of that show, oh my God, The White Lotus, the cunty little bob is like in style right now, but it's typically a very straight bob. Anyway, the reason I say that is because this is kind of what her hair looks like, except she also has these harsh bangs. So she really looks like that professor, I think, on The Incredibles. Anyway, just to kind of give you an idea of what these people look like, not what you would assume a criminal eventually looks like. And so the fact that they met at a Dungeons and Dragons club of all places, I think is just kind of a funny detail. But Jim attended her brother's wake in 1986 to support her, and then their relationship grew from there. They married in 1989 in a simple ceremony held at the same church where Seth's funeral had taken place. Sam Bishop, Amy's father, had advised her that one way to cope with her loss was to create life herself. So Amy really took that to heart, and in 1991, at age 26, she gave birth to her first daughter, a child named Lily, and then two more daughters, Thea and Phaedra, followed in the next few years. Friends recall Amy as a loving but high-strung mother, the type who only bought organic food, pushed her kids to play musical instruments, and constantly worried about whether they were being challenged enough at school. I find this kind of funny because I think this is like typical of most new moms. Like that first kid, you want to do like all the organic stuff. You want to do everything right. You're like hyper stressed all the time that you're doing everything right. I remember when I had Jack, he's almost 12 now, but at the time I was like, I'm going to buy organic avocados and I'm going to blend them up in my own little baby blender and feed them to him. And he's going to be like so smart. Well, he is so smart, but I've also caught him licking the butter off the inside of a popcorn bag. And I just kind of pick my battles. So anyway, all of that is to say, most people kind of come down to earth, back to earth after they have more than one child. But for Amy, that just didn't happen.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. It's the ultimate bundle for an unbelievable price. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. Get it and watch Marvel Television's Ironheart on Disney Plus.
I want to build something iconic.
A new season of The Bear on Hulu.
We can make people happy.
And The Epic, a Minecraft movie on Max.
Anything you can imagine is possible.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. All these and more streaming soon. Terms apply. Visit DisneyPlusHuluMaxBundle.com for details.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
So in 1996, Amy's parents found it too painful to remain in the house filled with memories of Seth, apparently saying there were too many ghosts, as Sam put it. So they sold their home in Braintree and moved to a new town. By that time, Amy and Jim had been living with their young children in a small cottage on the Hollis Avenue property, which had allowed Judy Bishop to babysit easily while Amy worked on her postdoctoral research. With her parents relocating, though, Amy lost some of that built-in family support, but still, she pressed on with her career in science. Throughout the 90s, Amy held several postdoctoral fellowships in the Boston area. One was at the prestigious Harvard School of Public Health, and another at Boston's Children's Hospital in a lab run by Dr. Paul Rosenberg. These positions helped her build experience, but not without some bumps. Amy's stint in Dr. Rosenberg's lab in 1993 ended on a bit of a sour note. She resigned, or was fired, after receiving an unfavorable performance review from Dr. Rosenberg, and this conflict with a supervisor would come back to haunt in a pretty unexpected way. Outside of lab work, Amy had creative pursuits as well. She wrote poetry in college and later turned to writing fiction, joining a local writers group in Massachusetts. Over the years, she wrote 3 unpublished novels, all techno-thrillers in the vein of Michael Crichton. Her fiction echoed aspects of her own life. Her protagonists were women scientists, often of Greek heritage, with big career ambitions who were haunted by the death of someone close to them. Sound familiar? Themes of guilt, redemption, and motherhood laid the foundation for most of her books. In one novel, Easter in Boston, the main character agonizes over whether any amount of calling on the Lord Jesus would erase her sins. In another story, a character finds solace only upon realizing that, quote, Jesus loves you no matter what you've done, end quote. So it was clear that Amy was kind of processing her own trauma and, she was on this search for forgiveness through these fictional characters. And indeed, Amy had experienced a religious awakening after her brother's death, becoming an evangelical Christian, even as she pursued a career that was grounded in science. So she told friends and later journalists that she had accepted Jesus Christ as her savior and read the Bible regularly, looking for deliverance from the weight of her past. Amy's writer friends had mixed impressions of her. On one hand, she could be warm, witty, and supportive, quick with a bit of barbed humor, and genuine prayers when someone was struggling. But on the other hand, she often came off as arrogant and abrasive. She bragged that a literary agent was working to get her a book deal, and she loved to drop the fact that she had a Harvard PhD, and even a distant family tied to novelist John Irving, as if that set her above everyone else. In writing workshops, Amy had little patience for polite critique. She would bluntly just say, kill it, about any story element that she disliked. Her volatility even earned her the jokey nickname Crazy Amy among her friends, said with affection, but rooted in the reality that Jamie vibrated at a high frequency, as one friend put it. There were quirks in her personality, moments of surprisingly intense emotion over small slights, but no one around her back then imagined that those traits would manifest in future violence. In 2001, Amy and Jim Anderson welcomed their 4th child, a baby boy named Seth, after the brother that she had lost. Remarkably, baby Seth was born on what would have been the 33rd birthday of his namesake Uncle Seth. Many of Amy's acquaintances had no idea of the significance. They didn't even know that Amy had a brother who died, since she rarely talked about it. And one friend recalled chatting with Amy about baby names, completely unaware of the tragic backstory behind the name Seth that Amy had chosen. By the early 2000s, Dr. Amy Bishop had a growing family and a newly minted Harvard PhD, but she had not yet landed a permanent academic position as a teacher. So she spent a few more years in postdoctoral roles. Those who knew the couple observed that Amy was the ambitious one, effectively the family's sole breadwinner, while Jim did not have an advanced degree and only worked sporadically, often in technician jobs that Amy helped him get in her labs. So Amy often expressed frustration about this imbalance. She half-jokingly described Jim as too smart to work, and in her novels, she portrayed husbands who were underachievers holding back their wives. Now, can you imagine her husband reading these novels and realizing how much of it parallels with what Amy's life had been up to that point, and then you read about these husbands that are just like couch potatoes holding their wives back, essentially, and like the pressure that is put on a wife to be the breadwinner. Like, I just can't imagine the husband reading that and not realizing that it's about him. But I guess we don't really always know what goes on behind closed doors, if he was aware of this like resentment or not. And then in 2003, Amy finally secured a tenure-track faculty job. She was hired as an assistant professor of biology at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, or UAH. So the family packed up and moved from Massachusetts to Alabama for a fresh start. In Amy's third novel manuscript, she had grandly referred to UAH as the MIT of the South, reflecting her hopes that this position would bring prestige and stability to her own life, almost romanticizing this change. Amy and Jim even began working together on developing an automated cell incubator device, which the university proudly touted in the press as an innovation that could change the way biological and medical research is conducted. Now, it looked like Dr. Bishop was on a track for a successful career in academia. However, from early on at UAH, there were signs that Amy's professional trajectory was not entirely smooth. Colleagues and students found her to be highly intelligent, but also abrasive and erratic in her behavior. She had a tendency to remind everyone that she was Harvard trained and to disparage her new environment by telling students that they were not as bright as the ones she taught at Harvard. Now, not surprisingly, she didn't have many admirers with this kind of attitude. Amy's teaching evaluations suffered, and multiple graduate students asked to be transferred out of her lab after she abruptly dismissed some of them without clear cause. She seemed to lack some of the collegial and mentoring skills that being a professor demands. Amy was also not publishing much research, which is really the lifeblood of a tenure-track scientist. She spent considerable time on the cell incubator invention and pursuing patents with Jim, but ignored repeated warnings from senior faculty that failing to publish papers would jeopardize her tenure prospects. So by 2009, 6 years into her appointment, her publication record was quite thin. And then, in a rather unusual move, that year she published a paper in the International Journal of General Medicine, which is an online journal regarded by many as a vanity press, and listed as co-authors her husband and her kids, Lily, Thea, and Phaedra. When asked later why on earth the children were co-authors, Jim explained that they had envisioned doing a lot of work side by side and bringing the kids on it like the Curies did. Well, the episode was odd, to say the least, and it raised eyebrows among Amy's colleagues. In hindsight, it was one of several erratic choices that she made as pressure mounted in her career. Putting your kids as co-authors of this paper, as if they had any kind of intellectual contributions to this piece, is like putting your dogs down as dependents on your taxes. It's obviously not based in reality, and it really is only self-serving. It can get you in a lot of trouble. It seemed like she maybe was doing it for an assumed benefit of having more names on the paper. I don't really know why anyone would do that. But meanwhile, outside of work, Amy didn't have the same support system that she'd had in Massachusetts. She grew increasingly isolated in Alabama, drifting away from old friends and even family because she would not return their calls or their emails. And balancing the roles of professor, researcher, wife, and mother of 4 took a toll. Now, I can't imagine that. I mean, I think I only have the bandwidth for this podcast and that's it. I can't imagine having 4 kids. I have 4 children, but I can't imagine having 4 kids and also trying to be this college professor. That is just a different breed of person. I know that there are people out there that do it, but I can't imagine the pressure that all comes with. So those around her could see that she was under immense stress. The recurring theme of her fiction, the tension between being a dedicated scientist and a devoted mom, was playing out in her real life. Amy was essentially doing double duty, raising young kids, including a baby and toddler in the mid-2000s, and trying to meet the unforgiving demands of academia. She was clearly under a great deal of stress running her home and looking after her family, as well as pushing forward in her career. By 2009, her behavior had become, as colleagues later described, increasingly erratic and unbalanced. Sure, if one looks at Amy Bishop's life in the years and decades leading up to 2010, certain red flags do emerge. The first major one had occurred back in 1993 during her postdoc days, and it was this incident with Dr. Paul Rosenberg receiving a mail bomb. So shortly after Amy's contentious departure from Dr. Rosenberg's lab, Dr. Rosenberg received a package at his home containing 2 pipe bombs attached to a trigger mechanism. Thankfully, he handled the suspicious package carefully, aware that at the time, the Unabomber was like a big deal, and he thankfully avoided detonating the device. But the attempted bombing was investigated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and shockingly, both Amy and her husband Jim were questioned as suspects. Investigators learned that the young couple had oddly spoken to friends about how to build a pipe bomb, and Amy had once given a college friend a joke gift of about 10 pounds of potassium permanganate. Oh my gosh, you guys, this is not my forte, saying these chemicals, but apparently it's a chemical that can be used in explosives. However, there was not enough evidence to charge anyone in the Rosenberg case. Amy and Jim denied any involvement, and the crime remains unsolved. But still, in retrospect, the fact that a Harvard-educated scientist and her husband were even indirectly linked to a mail bomb is unsettling. Another red flag came 9 years later in 2002 when Amy and her family were living in Massachusetts. She was still doing postdoctoral work, possibly getting ready for the move to UAH. But one Saturday morning, they went out to breakfast at an IHOP in Peabody, Massachusetts. The restaurant was busy, and when Amy requested a booster seat for baby Seth, a waitress informed her that the last booster seat had just been given to another family. Well, this trivial disappointment just infuriated Amy. According to a police report, Amy confronted the other customer, who was a mother seated with her own kids, and launched into a screaming, expletive-laced tirade, saying things like, "But we were here first," and touting that she is Dr. Amy Bishop, as if her status entitled her to some kind of special treatment. When the other woman refused to hand over the seat, Amy punched her in the head with a closed fist. Now, this outburst in an IHOP was so extreme that it's almost hard to believe. Amy was promptly arrested by local police for assault and disorderly conduct, yet, true to a pattern, the charges were later dropped and never appeared on her record. It seems the victim didn't pursue it, and Amy once again faced no legal consequences for her behavior. Beyond those headline-grabbing incidents, coworkers and students reported lesser oddities from Amy over the years. She was known to have sudden emotional outbursts or disproportionate reactions to minor inconveniences. Her father-in-law later remarked that he had seen the devil in her eyes during one of her fits. In general, an image was gradually forming of a volatile, unregulated personality, someone with a deep well of anger who tended to retaliate when she felt wronged. Still, none of it, not even the pipe bomb inquiry, pointed obviously towards murder, and Amy Bishop had no criminal convictions, no documented mental health issues, and no history of substance abuse. She was a respected scientist, a mother of 4, and a Harvard graduate, certainly not the type of person you would expect to retaliate in a huge, violent way. Or maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe all of that mounting pressure is indicative of someone who's on the brink of snapping, and I guess there's an argument that can be made for that. But by 2009, Amy Bishop's career at UAH was at a crossroads. That year, she went up for tenure, which in academia is a make-or-break moment. Earning your tenure means a lifetime faculty appointment. So failing to get it usually means losing your job. Amy had been working toward this goal since she was hired in 2003, so for about 6 years. But as noted, her record had some holes. There was lack of publications, there were teaching issues with students and even some of her coworkers. So when the biology department's tenure committee reviewed her case, they decided to deny her tenure in the spring of 2009. This was obviously devastating news for Amy. She appealed the decision repeatedly through 2009, filing grievance after grievance, even hiring a lawyer at one point to press her case. All of her appeals failed, and the university's final decision was that Amy's employment would end after the 2009-2010 academic year. Essentially, the spring 2010 semester would be her last at UAH if she didn't find some way to overturn their ruling. Colleagues knew that Amy was extremely upset about the tenure denial. She reportedly told one friend in late 2009 that her life was over, and at least one member of the tenure committee had harbored concerns about Amy's mental stability even before all this. So that committee member later told reporters that he worried about her state of mind 5 minutes after he met her, essentially calling her crazy in retrospect. The majority of her colleagues, however, did not anticipate violence. They saw her as odd, yes, but not homicidal. In fact, Amy had some friends in the department, including Professor Deborah Moriarty, who is an important figure later on, but Dr. Moriarty was friendly with her and knew how upset she was. Deborah had even tried to comfort Amy, reassuring her, you'll find another position. It's just a matter of the right fit. But Amy wasn't having any of it. She was despondent and pessimistic, convinced that without tenure at UAH, her hopes of being a successful scientist were ruined. As the fall of 2009 turned into winter, Amy's behavior grew more alarming to those paying close attention. In one incident, she drove to UAH's administration building and called the university president's office from the parking lot, announcing that she was coming upstairs to talk about her tenure case. So in response, the president at the time, Dr. David Williams, and the provost actually fled the building under police escort, avoiding a confrontation with Amy. Now, it's unclear if Amy was aware of just how afraid they were of her, because she later phoned Deborah Moriarty complaining, saying, "They act like I'm going to walk in and shoot somebody," essentially feeling insulted by the implication. But this comment is really chilling in hindsight, given what would happen shortly thereafter. Amy also seemed to fixate on cautionary tales of scientific careers gone awry. She frequently brought up the story of Dr. Douglas Prasher, a biologist who had lost his funding and then left academia only to watch others win a Nobel Prize based partly on his work, while he ended up driving a shuttle van in Huntsville. His fate deeply worried Amy. She told her husband that she feared she might suffer a similar fall from grace. And so to an already fragile ego, the prospect of such humiliation was just agonizing, unbearable, unacceptable to Amy. Around this time, Amy took steps that in retrospect look like preparations. Although she technically did not have a permit to carry a concealed handgun, a 9mm Ruger P95 pistol had somehow made its way into the Bishop household. Jim Anderson, her husband, later admitted that he acquired the gun years before while living in New England. A friend purchased it in New Hampshire and gave it to him, skirting the Massachusetts waiting period laws. That pistol had sat unused for a long time, but now, a week before the fatal department meeting, Amy and Jim went to Larry's Pistol and Pawn, which is a local firing range, to practice target shooting with that gun. So if Jim had any reservations about putting a firearm in Amy's hands at this volatile moment, he did not show it. And he declined to speak in detail about this afterward, but acquaintances suspected that Jim often acted as sort of an enabler for Amy's grievances, essentially fanning her sense of outrage rather than calming her down. So by February of 2010, Amy's appeals had run out. She knew her job was ending in mere months, and multiple colleagues recall that she was extremely bitter. Still, she kept teaching her classes and showing up to work. Students who attended her lecture the day of February 12th, 2010, said that she seemed perfectly normal in class that morning. No one could have imagined what she was about to do later that day.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Choice Hotels get you more for your money so you can maximize any road trip. Let's get real close to hear the maximum sizzle of Comfort Inn's free hot breakfast. Maximized. Check into more. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
On Friday, February 12th, 2010, about a dozen faculty and staff of the UAH biology department gathered for a routine faculty meeting on the third floor of the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. The meeting convened around 3 or 3:30, and by all accounts, it was an ordinary agenda discussing plans for the next semester. Amy was in attendance, even though much of the discussion did not concern her since she was not going to be there in the fall. And normally quite talkative, Amy sat uncharacteristically quiet through the 50-minute-long meeting, which others simply attributed to her situation. Perhaps she was disengaging or disconnected since she'd be leaving the university. She chose a seat near the door beside the department chair, Dr. Gopi Podilla. Then, just as the meeting was wrapping up at approximately 4 p.m., Amy stood up, pulled out the 9mm handgun from her handbag, and opened fire at her unsuspecting colleagues. Without saying a word, she first shot Dr. Gopi Podilla point blank in the head. She then turned and began methodically shooting the others at the table one by one. A survivor described how Amy started with the person closest to her and then just went down the row, targeting each in turn, aiming for their heads, execution style. Total chaos erupted in the small conference room as people realized what was happening. Dr. Adriel Johnson, a cell biologist, was shot next. Dr. Maria Ragdalen Davis, a researcher, was also shot and collapsed. Stephanie Monticello, a department staff assistant, was struck by a bullet and gravely wounded. Other faculty dropped to the floor or dived under the long oval table trying to hide. There was only one door, and Amy was blocking it with the gun in her hand. In those terrifying seconds, it was essentially like shooting fish in a barrel. One of the participants of the meeting, Professor Deborah Moriarty, the same friend who had tried to console Amy about her losing her tenure, reacted with astonishing courage. Deborah was at the far end of the room and initially froze at the sight of Amy firing. When Amy's deadly circuit around the table brought the gun toward Deborah, Deborah pleaded, "Amy, don't do this. Think of my daughter. Think of my grandson." Amy momentarily looked down at her, seemingly hearing the personal appeal, and then she squeezed the trigger aimed at Deborah. Click. The gun did not fire. Amy had either emptied the magazine or the firearm had jammed after about 7 rounds. She tried to fire again at Deborah. Click. Still nothing. In that split-second miracle, Deborah Moriarty saw that Amy's attention was on the weapon, so Deborah crawled rapidly past Amy and made a break for the door in the hall. Amy pursued her, repeatedly trying to get the gun working again and pulling the trigger to no avail. Deborah managed to get back inside the conference room, and she and another colleague slammed the door and barricaded it shut with their bodies. This prevented Amy from re-entering and undoubtedly saved lives. Inside the room, the scene was horrific. As one prosecutor later described, it looked like a bomb went off, like it was a war zone with blood everywhere. In less than 1 minute of violence, Amy Bishop had shot a total of 6 colleagues. Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Ragdalen Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson were killed. Dr. Joseph Leahy was shot in the head but somehow survived, and he would endure a long recovery and eventually return to teaching. Stephanie Monticello was critically injured but also survived after having treatment. Another professor, Dr. Louis Cruz Vera, was hit in the chest but likewise survived. Deborah Moriarty was unharmed physically, but can you imagine a gun being pointed at you and clicking twice? In an instant, 3 people were dead, 3 were wounded, and the rest were traumatized eyewitnesses. There was no mystery about who the shooter was. 9 surviving witnesses in that room could identify Amy as the perpetrator without question. After her gun misfired and the survivors barricaded the door, Amy Bishop walked away. The shooting was over, and in a calm, almost surreal postscript, Amy went down 1 floor to a ladies' restroom. There, she washed the blood off her hands and face and dumped the 9mm pistol and her bloody blazer into a trash can. She then emerged and approached a graduate student in a lab, asking to borrow his cell phone to make a phone call. At about 4:05 p.m., Amy dialed her husband, Jim, who was waiting to pick her up after the meeting as usual, and according to Jim, she just said, "I'm done." Amy then exited the building via a loading dock door at the back, and by that time, campus police and sheriff's deputies were swarming the area, responding to multiple 911 calls. A deputy found Amy outside and took her into custody without incident. She did not fight or attempt to flee. In fact, as officers handcuffed her, Amy seemed oddly detached. People reported that she kept murmuring, "It didn't happen. There's no way. It didn't happen." In the immediate aftermath, Amy refused to explain anything to detectives, denying even being at the scene. "It wasn't me," she insisted to an officer during an interrogation, as if she could just wish away the reality. The news of a shooting on a university campus by a female professor sent shockwaves nationwide. Within hours, satellite news trucks converged on Huntsville to cover the story. Campus shootings were tragically not uncommon in America by 2010, but this case stood out. It was exceedingly rare for a woman, especially a middle-aged academic with no criminal record, to commit mass murder. The sheer novelty of an Ivy League-educated female scientist going rogue on her peers guaranteed intense media scrutiny. Headline writers immediately grabbed onto the narrative that Amy Bishop snapped after being denied tenure, the classic publish or perish pressure cooker scenario. However, as investigators dug into Amy's background, a more disturbing picture emerged. Perhaps this wasn't a one-off eruption of workplace rage at all, but the final act in a pattern of violence that had been brewing for years. The morning after the shooting on February 13th, 2010, the authorities in Huntsville got a phone call from up north that changed everything. Paul Frazier, the police chief of Braintree, Massachusetts, contacted them and revealed, "The woman you have in custody, she shot and killed her brother back in 1986. This bombshell information had never shown up in any background check. UAH hadn't done one when hiring Amy, but even if they had, it likely wouldn't have surfaced because she was never charged with anything. The Alabama officials were stunned. Their seemingly upstanding professor-turned-shooter might have actually killed before. News of the Seth Bishop case reopening made headlines, especially in Massachusetts. People started asking why Amy was never charged back then, who might have covered it up, and whether that tragic incident was really an accident or an early sign of a bad seed. Under public pressure, Massachusetts authorities launched a full inquest into the 1986 shooting in the spring of 2010. In April, a courthouse in Quincy, Massachusetts convened hearings where about 20 witnesses, including officers from 1986 and others, testified about what they remembered. But I mean, you have to remember, this is like 30 years, I guess, probably almost 30 years after this happened. But still, this inquest unearthed some startling details that had long been buried. Investigators even scrutinized old crime scene photos from Amy's bedroom and noticed a National Enquirer magazine visible on the floor. And that particular issue, they discovered, contained an article about the November 1986 murders of actor Patrick Duffy's parents, who were shot with a 12-gauge shotgun by two assailants and then tried to steal a getaway car. So the parallels to Amy's situation were eerie. A shotgun killing and then an attempted carjacking. Prosecutors wondered if teenaged Amy, who she wasn't teenage, she was actually 21 at the time, but they wondered if Amy might have read that story as some kind of twisted instruction manual. It was speculative, but it did hint at premeditation. More concretely, however, several police officers from Braintree testified that back in 1986, they had wanted to charge Amy with crimes like assault with a dangerous weapon and even murder, but were overruled. Sergeant Kenneth Brady stated he actually wrote up charges of murder on the booking sheet only to have them negated when Amy was abruptly ordered released. Lieutenant Sullivan, who had been interviewing Amy at the station that day, recounted how Judy Bishop, her mom, entered the room, which is a breach of protocol, and soon after he was instructed by supervisors to stop the interrogation because Chief John Polio believed that the shooting was accidental. Sullivan remembered protesting, saying, quote, "If we let every person go because their mother didn't think they committed a crime, there would be no point in arresting anyone," which is honestly a great point. But his objections fell on deaf ears. Amy was freed due to Polio's intervention, at least according to these officers' testimony. The inquest also heard from Amy's parents. Sam Bishop downplayed the argument that he had with Amy early that morning. Apparently, he got after her for not cleaning up after herself, and it turned into kind of a big argument. And then, of course, the shooting happened just a couple hours later. So some people feel like there's a line there. But he insists that Amy had just been traumatized by the earlier burglary and was just simply fearful in their big Victorian house when she made the mistake of loading the gun. And then Judy Bishop recounted the event as a pure accident. She claimed Amy had one hand on the shotgun's barrel and one on the stock while Seth reached over to help, and that the weapon suddenly fired without Amy even pulling the trigger. Now, Judy was a powerful witness as the mother who saw her son die. Her tearful testimony was heart-wrenching, and she adamantly denied any suggestion that Amy did it intentionally. She also denied that she was friends with Chief Polio or had any special influence. And interestingly, Polio's widow came forward to say that the chief had been in the building during Amy's booking in '86 and that he did not directly order her release, but Polio died in late 2010. So some questions just remain unanswered. Ultimately, the inquest's findings led to a Norfolk County grand jury indicting Amy Bishop in June of 2010 for first-degree murder in the death of her brother. To many in Braintree, this felt like delayed justice for Seth. Judy and Sam Bishop, however, stood by their daughter. They released a statement reaffirming their belief that Seth's shooting was an accident and expressed bewilderment at what had happened in Alabama. Back in Huntsville, Amy remained jailed awaiting trial for the UAH shootings. Not long after learning of her indictment in Massachusetts, Amy attempted to take her own life. On June 18th of 2010, 2 days after the indictment was announced, Amy was found in her Alabama jail cell with cuts on her wrists, having used a razor blade to try to slit them. She survived and later told a reporter in a chillingly clinical tone that unlike a previous half-hearted suicide attempt she'd made decades earlier after Seth's death, this time she, quote, slashed longitudinally over the radial artery, end quote, using her knowledge of human anatomy. Investigators also revisited the 1993 mail bomb case in light of Amy's rampage. The Rosenberg bombing investigation was reopened to see if any new evidence might implicate Amy or her husband, but nothing conclusive was found. To this day, that crime remains unsolved, and no charges have ever been filed against the Andersons for it. As all this came out, the media narrative around Amy Bishop had shifted. She was no longer seen simply as a stressed-out academic who snapped. She was now depicted as something far more sinister, a person with a catalog of unheeded warnings throughout her life. A UAH University trustee angrily told reporters, quote, people kept sweeping her bad behavior under the rug, and now we're paying a tremendous price, end quote. In Alabama, Amy Bishop was charged with 1 count of capital murder. So for 3 killings, which under Alabama law can be charged as a single capital count since multiple victims were involved, and 3 counts of attempted murder for the colleagues who were shot and survived. Initially, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Her defense team had her undergo psychological evaluations, and there were indications that Amy might have some mental illness. She later claimed to have hallucinated and heard voices under stress, but the assessments were inconclusive. It was all going to be an uphill battle to convince a jury that she was legally insane, especially given the apparent premeditation, bringing a loaded gun to the meeting and then going to target practice a few days prior to that event. And then, of course, the fact that she lacked any documented psychosis prior to that event. And, I think it's a cheap shot to say, oh, well, I was insane when you shoot somebody, because it is such an insane thing to do. But just because you shoot somebody doesn't mean you can claim that you're clinically insane. So I see this happen all the time. We see it as true crime enthusiasts, I guess, that people always try to use that excuse. But yeah, I think Amy was just evil to her core. In her core, she was an evil, dark, disturbed individual. So Amy's trial was scheduled to begin on September 24th of 2012. But shortly before that date, a plea deal was reached. The families of Amy's victims were not eager to endure a long trial or risk a protracted death penalty process. And in a humanitarian gesture, several relatives actually petitioned the court asking that the prosecutors not seek the death penalty. They just wanted Amy brought to justice with life in prison rather than an execution. And we see that happen a lot also, that the families will forego a death penalty conviction because they know all the hoops and the appeals and the process that goes along with that. And so they're like, you know what, life in prison is fine with me. It's apples and oranges at this point, I guess, and tomato, right? But the prosecution was open to a deal under those terms, and Amy's lawyer approached them 2 weeks before the trial to negotiate. Amy Bishop agreed to plead guilty to the capital murder and attempted murder charges in exchange for removing the death penalty option. So essentially, it would be life in prison without parole, no chance of execution, and no trial. On September 11th of 2012, in a Huntsville courtroom, Amy formally entered guilty pleas to all of the charges. Then 2 weeks later, on September 24th of 2012, a brief hearing was held just to satisfy an Alabama legal requirement that even with a guilty plea in a capital case, a jury must review at least a summary of the evidence. So Amy appeared in court in a red prison jumpsuit, shackled and looking pale and thin with her cunty little bob haircut. And as prosecutors somberly recounted the details of her crimes, graphic photos of the slain faculty were shown, and Amy buried her head in her arms on the table and wept. When the judge directly asked her to confirm that she was pleading guilty and waiving her right to an appeal, Amy spoke softly and just said, yes, and nothing more. The jury then officially found her guilty, and the judge imposed the agreed-upon sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 47 years old, Amy Bishop would spend the rest of her life behind bars. After Amy's Alabama plea, the Norfolk County District Attorney faced a decision up in Massachusetts whether to extradite Amy to stand trial for Seth's death in 1986. So in theory, Massachusetts could prosecute her for first-degree murder even decades later because there's no statute of limitations on murder. But in practice, it would have been an extremely difficult case to try, nearly 26 years after the fact, with key evidence missing and witnesses' memories faded or suspect. Furthermore, Massachusetts does not have the death penalty, and Amy was already serving the maximum sentence of life without parole in Alabama. So in September of 2012, the DA, Michael Morrissey, announced that Massachusetts would not proceed with a separate murder trial for Amy. He said, quote, "The penalty we would seek for a first-degree murder conviction is already in place," noting that a life without parole sentence already was secured, so there's no public safety benefit to another trial. Amy was then transferred to the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And she was there to serve her sentence. Tutwiler is a medium security state prison known for its overcrowding, but Amy reportedly has had a relatively routine existence there. As of 2020, at age 55, she was sleeping in an open dormitory-style unit in Tutwiler, just another inmate among many. In some ways, she hasn't kept a low profile even behind bars, so there were some reports shared by her lawyer of Amy getting into scuffles, and at one point, she got beaten by another inmate with a lunch tray. And on another occasion, Amy herself punched out a fellow prisoner, actually 3 different prisoners, by her own account anyway, in what she claimed was self-defense. Despite having formally waived her appeal rights as part of the plea, Amy Bishop couldn't resist trying to undo the outcome. In 2013, she filed an appeal of her conviction and sentence, alleging procedural errors. Her appeal argued, among other things, that the trial judge failed to explicitly tell her that she could withdraw her guilty plea and that her attorneys had not properly represented her. Legal analysts noted that because she never moved to withdraw the plea or raised these issues at the time, her arguments were weak, and on April 26th of 2013, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her appeal, ruling that she had not challenged the plea's validity in the lower court and thus had no basis to overturn it. Then in 2014, she argued that she was schizophrenic and hadn't been assessed correctly, and that her lawyer misinformed her about her rights. But since she had voluntarily waived appeals, the courts were not inclined to listen. So the Alabama Supreme Court also refused to review her case, effectively ending any legal avenues for Amy to get out of prison. And as of today, Amy Bishop remains incarcerated for life with no further appeals pending. After this tragedy, UAH implemented a new system called the Behavioral Evaluation and Threat Assessment Team, or BETA for short. This interdisciplinary team's role is to receive and evaluate reports of any faculty, staff, or students exhibiting worrisome or disruptive behavior. They classify individuals on a risk scale from extreme, high, moderate to low, and intervene where possible. For instance, if someone is going through a stressful process like a tenure denial and they start showing signs of severe agitation, or they threaten to self-harm or to harm others, then the BETA team can step in to get them counseling or take safety measures. And in theory, had such a system been in place in 2009, someone might have flagged Amy's erratic conduct or the warning signs, like her outburst at the president's office whenever they left under police escort. But it's not a guarantee. It's just an extra net to catch persons of concern. It's like really the best you can do without what do you call those? Oh my gosh. Crystal ball. By the end of these episodes, my brain is just kind of mush, so I apologize for the stuttering. But one area that did not change as much as some hoped is how institutions handle the emotional fallout of tenure denials. So Dr. Deborah Moriarty, who heroically survived and helped stop Amy that day, later became the department chair of biology for a time. She lobbied for the university to implement automatic counseling or support for faculty who don't get tenure, recognizing the severe psychological blow that it can cause to some of these people. The administration's view was that they offer help and there is an employee assistance program available, and departments try to assist with finding other employment, but they cannot force anyone to take counseling. In Amy's case, she likely would have recoiled at the suggestion that she needed therapy after her tenure rejection. I mean, think about whenever she would snap over just small critiques for her fiction novels. So yeah, she's probably not going to accept help willingly, but the Amy Bishop case is an extreme outlier. But it does underscore that universities are not immune to workplace violence. For the families of the victims, the only solace was that justice was served in the sense that Amy can never hurt anyone else. Amy's 3 slain colleagues, Dr. Podilla, Dr. Davis, and Dr. Johnson, were all beloved and accomplished in their own rights. They were honored by UAH with a memorial garden along the campus greenway, a living garden where people can reflect on the tragedy, and every year, especially on milestone anniversaries, the UAH community gathers there to remember those who were lost. The garden is also meant to remind everyone to, if you see something, say something. Speak up if you observe concerning behavior rather than brushing it aside. And it's just so in tune with what I say at the end of every episode, which is stay curious, stay vigilant. Mama Mystery out.